I'll forget you in a week. I've already found someone better. She said it loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, then threw her engagement ring into the salad bowl like it was a piece of garbage. Her cousin laughed. Her mother nodded with relief. And me? I just wiped my mouth with a napkin, looked her straight in the eyes, and smiled. Because Emily Mason had no idea what was coming for her. My name is Mark Reed, and 6 months ago, the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with threw her engagement ring into a bowl of Caesar salad in front of her entire family and told me I was nothing but a grease monkey who was dragging her down to the gutter. She said she'd forget me in a week because she'd already found someone better, someone who understood her level, whatever the hell that meant. She said all of this while her mother nodded like a bobblehead on a dashboard, and her cousin laughed so hard wine came out of his nose. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table or throw a punch. I just wiped my mouth with a napkin, stood up, and walked out of that house without looking back. And then I did something that she never expected, something that would unravel her carefully constructed life like a bad timing belt on a hot summer day. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment when I first saw Emily Mason and made the biggest miscalculation of my entire 32 years on this planet. It was the Fall Festival in Flagstone, Colorado, the kind of small-town event where everybody knows everybody, and strangers stick out like a chrome bumper on a rusted-out pickup. The air was thick with the smell of roasted almonds, wood smoke, and the promise of an early winter rolling down from the mountains. I was standing next to my booth at the vintage car show, wiping my hands on an old shop rag and watching families wander past displays of restored Mustangs, Camaros, and the occasional exotic European import that some rich guy from Denver had trailered up the mountain just to show off. I had brought my project car that year, a 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS that I'd been working on for almost 3 years at that point. She wasn't finished yet, still sitting on Premier with her interior stripped down to bare metal, but her engine was a thing of beauty, a numbers-matching LS6454 that I had rebuilt from the crankshaft up. And when I fired her up for the crowd, the rumble made people's chest cavities vibrate like they were standing next to a drummer at a rock concert. That's the thing about big block engines from the golden age of American muscle. They don't whisper. They announce themselves like thunder rolling across the plains. I was explaining the restoration process to an older gentleman who remembered when these cars were brand new on dealer lots when I noticed her approaching from across the fairgrounds. She was wearing a camel-colored coat that looked expensive and completely impractical for him. The muddy conditions, picking her way through the crowd like she was afraid the regular people might be contagious. Her makeup was perfect, not a hair out of place, and she was shivering so hard I thought she might crack. Most guys would have seen a beautiful woman and started thinking about pickup lines. I saw someone who was going to catch pneumonia because she'd prioritized looking good over staying warm. It's a character flaw of mine, I suppose, always diagnosing problems, whether people ask me to or not. She stopped at my display, arms wrapped around herself, teeth chattering, and pretended to be interested in the Chevelle. I could tell she didn't know a carburetor from a catalytic converter, but she made appreciative noises and asked questions that were obviously designed to keep me talking while she sheltered from the wind behind my trailer. After about 5 minutes of this dance, I couldn't take it anymore. I shrugged off my leather jacket, the one that had been my father's and still smelled like the old shop back in Denver, where I'd learned everything I knew about cars, and I draped it over her shoulders without asking permission. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes, surprised, and for just a moment I saw something genuine underneath all that carefully applied armor. Something vulnerable. Something that made me want to protect her from whatever it was that had made her so determined to present a perfect facade to the world. That was my first mistake. I saw what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. She told me her name was Emily Mason and that she worked for a PR agency out of Denver. She was in Flagstone scouting locations for some corporate team-building event, the kind of thing where executives pretend to rough it for a weekend while drinking wine that costs more than my monthly utility bill. She found my jacket charming and my rugged authenticity fascinating, which I now recognize as the kind of thing people say when they're already planning how to package you for their own purposes. We exchanged numbers, and 3 days later she called me. We met at Hank's Diner, a greasy spoon joint just off the highway that had been serving burnt coffee and decent pie since my grandfather was a young man. She showed up overdressed, clearly uncomfortable with the vinyl booths and the waitress who called everyone honey, but she stayed for 3 hours listening to me talk about restoration work, about the satisfaction of bringing something beautiful back from the brink of death, about the way a perfectly tuned engine sounds like a symphony if you know how to listen. Looking back, I realized she wasn't listening to what I was saying. She was watching how I looked at her while I said it, cataloging my attention like it was a currency she could spend later. But at the time, I thought I'd found someone special, someone who saw past the calluses on my hands and the permanent grease stains under my fingernails to the person underneath. I thought she was the bright spot of color that my gray life had been missing. The truth is, I was lonely. My father had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving me the shop and a lifetime's worth of lessons about how to fix things that were broken. My mother had remarried and moved to Arizona, and we talked on holidays but had drifted apart the way families sometimes do when the person who held them together is gone. I had friends, sure, but they were work friends, guys I'd grab a beer with on Friday nights, but who wouldn't notice if I disappeared for a month. Emily showed up in my life like a sports car showing up at a classic car meet. She was flashy and exciting and completely different from everything I was used to. Of course I fell for her. I'm not a fool, but I am human, and humans make mistakes when they're hungry for connection. We dated for 8 months before she moved in with me. Well, technically, she moved us both into a new place, a rental house in a nice neighborhood that she picked out because it was presentable and had enough space for her to host dinner parties for her work friends. The rent was twice what I'd been paying for my apartment above the shop, but she promised we'd split it 50-50, and the place did have a 3-car garage where I could work on side projects when the shop was closed. I should have paid more attention to the warning signs, the way she'd wrinkle her nose when I came home smelling like work, the subtle digs about my clothes, my truck, my taste in music. The fact that she never, not once, came to visit me at Reed's Customs, the shop I'd inherited from my father and spent years building into something I was proud of. She'd drive past it sometimes on her way to somewhere more important, but she never came inside, never met my employees, never showed any interest in the thing that defined who I was as a person. But love makes you stupid, and I was stupidly in love. I told myself she just needed time to appreciate the simpler things in life. I told myself that once she saw how good we could be together, she'd stop caring about impressing people who didn't matter. I told myself a lot of lies because the truth was too uncomfortable to look at directly. When I proposed, I did it the only way I knew how. I found a ring with a diamond that cost me 4 months of savings, designed in a vintage Art Deco style because I thought it suited her somehow. Old-fashioned beauty with modern sparkle. I took her to the overlook on Flagstone Pass, where you can see 3 mountain ranges at once, and the sunset paints the sky in colors that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. I got down on one knee in the gravel, my heart pounding harder than it ever had before, and I asked her to be my wife. She said yes. She cried. She threw her arms around me and told me I was everything she'd ever wanted, and for about 30 seconds, I was the happiest man in Colorado. Then we started planning the wedding, and I began to understand exactly what kind of life I had signed up for. Emily didn't want a wedding. She wanted a production, a theatrical event designed to impress people who would judge every flower arrangement, every place setting, every note of music for signs of cheapness or poor taste. She wanted orchids flown in from Ecuador because apparently the orchids you could buy locally weren't good enough for a woman of her caliber. She wanted a photographer from New York, not because she'd seen his work, but because having a New York photographer told people something about who she was. She wanted a reception venue that charged more per head than some people make in a week, and she wanted it all paid for immediately because deposits were non-refundable, and she couldn't risk losing her preferred dates. I sat down with her one night and showed her the numbers. I had a spreadsheet, because that's how my brain works. I showed her what the wedding would cost versus what we had in savings versus what we needed for a down payment on a house. The math was brutal. If we did the wedding her way, we'd be starting our married life in debt, renting instead of owning, with no safety net if anything went wrong. She looked at that spreadsheet like I'd handed her a dead fish. "You don't understand," she said, and there was something in her voice that I'd never heard before, a kind of contempt that made my skin prickle. "This is my day. This is the most important day of my life. You want me to look cheap in front of everyone I know? You want people to think I'm marrying down?" That phrase, marrying down, hit me like a wrench to the skull. I asked her what she meant by that, and she backpedaled immediately, claiming she was just stressed, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded, that of course she didn't think she was better than me. But the words hung in the air between us like exhaust fumes, poisoning everything they touched. I agreed to the expensive wedding because I was still stupid enough to think that making her happy would eventually make us happy. I took on extra work at the shop, staying until midnight some nights to finish rush jobs that brought in premium fees. I skipped lunches and worked through weekends and drove myself into the ground, trying to afford the life she'd designed for us. Meanwhile, Emily forgot to pay her half of the rent for 3 months running, always with a new excuse ready. She'd had unexpected expenses at work. Her credit card bill was higher than expected because she'd had to buy new outfits for client meetings. She'd found these amazing shoes on sale, and it would have been financially irresponsible not to buy them. So she'd had to dip into her rent money. But she'd pay me back, she promised, next month for sure. I found those amazing shoes in the trunk of her car one day when I was changing her oil. They were still in the box, hidden under a gym bag she never used because Emily thought sweating was something that happened to other people. They cost $800. I know because I looked them up online, unable to believe anyone would pay that much for something you walked on. $800 that should have gone toward our shared expenses, our shared future, our shared life. Instead, they were sitting in her trunk like a guilty secret, waiting to be smuggled into the closet when I wasn't looking. That was when the diagnostic part of my brain kicked in, the part that looks for problems before they become catastrophes. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I noticed the password on her phone, a new addition. I noticed the scent of cologne that wasn't mine lingering on her clothes when she came home late from work events. I noticed the way her mileage increased by 50 miles on days when she claimed to be at the office, which was only a 20-minute drive from our house. I didn't confront her. Confrontation would have given her a chance to spin the story, to turn herself into the victim and me into the controlling boyfriend who didn't trust her. Instead, I did what I do best. I gathered information. I documented everything. I pulled our bank statements and credit card records and created a timeline of every expense, every payment, every withdrawal. I photographed receipts and saved screenshots of text conversations where she promised to pay her share of the bills. I put it all in a metal lockbox in the safe at my shop, the same safe where I kept my father's watch and the title to the Chevelle. And I kept acting like nothing was wrong because I needed to know the full extent of the damage before I could decide how to repair it. The answer came 3 weeks later at a dinner party at her parents' house. Emily's parents lived in one of those neighborhoods where the houses all look the same and everybody pretends their lives are perfect. Her father, Gerald, was a middle manager at an insurance company who acted like he ran a Fortune 500 corporation. Her mother, Patricia, was a professional socialite whose main hobby was judging other people for not being as sophisticated as she imagined herself to be. They had never liked me, not from the first moment Emily brought me home. Gerald looked at my work-roughened hands like they were covered in something contagious, and Patricia kept offering helpful suggestions about careers I might pursue if I ever wanted to better myself. That night, the table was set with crystal and silver because dinner at the Mason house was always a performance. Emily's cousin Derek was there with his wife, a mousy woman who spent the whole evening agreeing with everything Patricia said. Emily's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman in her 80s, who had built the family's original wealth through sheer ruthlessness, sat at the head of the table and watched everyone like she was keeping score. The conversation was the usual combination of bragging and backhanded compliments. Derek talked about his new boat. Patricia talked about her upcoming trip to Europe. Gerald talked about golf. Nobody asked me anything about my work or my life, which was fine with me. I ate my overcooked prime rib and counted the minutes until I could politely escape. Then Emily clinked her fork against her wine glass, and the room went quiet. She was drunk. I could tell by the flush on her cheeks and the slight slur in her speech, but nobody else seemed to notice or care. She stood up, wobbling slightly, and announced that she had something important to say. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. "Everyone," she said, her voice too loud for the intimate dining room. "I need to be honest with you all. And with Marky here." She never called me Marky. Nobody called me Marky. I've been struggling for months now, trying to convince myself that I could go through with this wedding, trying to pretend that I was happy settling for this. She gestured at me like I was a piece of furniture she'd grown tired of. The truth is, I deserve better. I deserve someone who understands my world, who moves in the right circles, who doesn't come home smelling like a gas station. I deserve someone who can take me to the places I want to go, instead of holding me back in some dead-end mountain town playing with old cars. The room was silent. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, each second stretching out like an hour. "I've met someone," she continued, and now she was smiling, that rehearsed smile she used for presentations. "Someone who sees my potential, someone who's going places. And I've realized that staying with Mark would be the biggest mistake of my life. So I'm ending it. Right here, right now, in front of all of you, because I want everyone to know that Emily Mason is done settling for less than she deserves." She yanked the engagement ring off her finger, the ring I'd spent 3 months choosing, and threw it across the table. It landed in the salad bowl with a soft plop, sinking into the Caesar dressing like a ship going down. Derek laughed. He actually laughed, a nasty snorting sound that made his wife flinch. Patricia put her hand over her heart and sighed with what looked like relief. Gerald nodded slowly, like this was exactly what he'd been hoping for all along. And Emily, my Emily, the woman I'd given 2 years of my life to, looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I'll forget you in a week. I've already found someone better." I want to tell you that I felt devastated in that moment. I want to tell you that my heart shattered into a million pieces and I had to fight back tears. But that's not what happened. What happened was something much colder, much more calculated. It was like watching a check engine light come on after months of ignoring strange noises. Suddenly, all the symptoms made sense. All the little inconsistencies, all the warning signs I'd been explaining away, they all clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't heartbroken. I was diagnosed. I picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth carefully, taking my time. I made eye contact with Emily, holding her gaze until she started to look uncomfortable. And then I spoke, my voice as level and calm as if I were discussing the weather. "All right then, you've made your choice." I stood up, pushed in my chair, and nodded politely to the grandmother, the only person at that table who had ever shown me a shred of respect. Then I walked out of that house, got into my truck, and drove away without looking back. I didn't go to a bar. I didn't call a friend to cry on their shoulder. I didn't even go home, because that house had never really been my home anyway. I drove to my shop, to Reed's Customs, where the air smelled like motor oil and honest work, and everything made sense. The Chevelle was waiting for me in the main bay, still incomplete, still a work in progress. I pulled up a stool, sat down next to her, and rested my hand on her cold metal fender. And I made a plan. See, here's the thing about being a mechanic. You learn that every problem has a solution if you're willing to put in the work. You learn to be patient, to be methodical, to gather all the information before you start tearing things apart. And you learn that sometimes the best way to deal with a catastrophic failure is to strip everything down to the bare metal and start fresh. I didn't waste time feeling sorry for myself. There would be time for that later, time to grieve the relationship I thought I'd had and the future I thought I'd been building. But right now, in this moment, I had work to do. I opened the safe and pulled out the lockbox. Inside were months' worth of documents, a paper trail that told the true story of my relationship with Emily Mason. Bank statements showing that I'd paid 100% of our rent and utilities for the past 6 months. Credit card receipts for wedding expenses, all charged to my accounts. Screenshots of text messages where she promised to pay me back, evidence of a verbal agreement she'd never honored. Contracts with wedding vendors, signed by both of us, making us jointly liable for deposits that would never be refunded. I spread everything out on my workbench and started making lists. Who was owed what? Who had paid for what? Where the money had actually gone versus where it was supposed to go. By the time the sun came up, I had a clear picture of the financial damage, and it was worse than I thought. Emily hadn't just broken her promises about splitting expenses. She'd actively used our joint accounts as her personal piggy bank, making purchases she'd hidden from me and covering them up by delaying her share of the bills until I got frustrated and paid them myself. Over the course of our relationship, I'd subsidized her lifestyle to the tune of almost $15,000, money I'd worked overtime to earn while she bought designer clothes and expensive dinners with co-workers who would later turn their backs on her. But here's the thing that turned my cold anger into something sharper, something with edges. As I went through the records, I started noticing patterns. Restaurant charges at places I'd never been to, always for two people. Hotel charges in Denver on nights she'd told me she was working late. Charges at boutiques and spas on days she'd claimed to be too busy to call me back. She hadn't just been wasting my money. She'd been using it to finance her affair. I should have been furious. I should have thrown something or screamed or punched a wall. But instead, I felt something like gratitude. Not for her betrayal, but for the clarity it brought. There was no ambiguity here, no room for second guessing. She hadn't just broken my heart. She'd broken a contract, violated my trust, and stolen my money. And unlike heartbreak, those things could be addressed in a court of law. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First, I called the wedding venue. I explained that the wedding was off and asked about their cancellation policy. The contract we'd signed gave us a 30-day window to cancel with a partial refund, and we were still within that window. They agreed to return 60% of the deposit to the card on file, which happened to be mine. That was $3,600 back in my pocket before Emily had even finished her morning coffee. Then I called the caterer, the florist, and the photographer. Same story each time. I was polite, apologetic about the inconvenience, and very clear that I was the one who had signed the contracts and paid the deposits. By noon, I had recovered almost half of what I'd spent on a wedding that would never happen. While I was making those calls, I also called my bank and had Emily removed as an authorized user on my credit card. Then I went online and changed the passwords on every shared account we had, from streaming services to the joint checking account I'd foolishly opened when she moved in. I didn't close the joint account yet because I wanted a record of any attempts she might make to access it, but I transferred all but $100 to my personal account where she couldn't touch it. By the time I was finished, Emily Mason had gone from having access to my finances to having access to absolutely nothing, and I was just getting started. I spent the next week building my case. I tracked down every promise she'd made in writing, every text and email, and direct message where she'd acknowledged owing me money or agreed to pay her share of our expenses. I calculated interest on the amount she'd failed to pay, using the same rate she'd have been charged if she'd put it on a credit card. I documented the timeline of her affair as best I could, not because I planned to use it against her, but because I wanted to understand the full scope of her deception. And then, exactly 10 days after she'd publicly humiliated me in front of her family, I filed a lawsuit. Small claims court is a beautiful thing. It's designed for exactly this kind of situation. Disputes between regular people over amounts that are too small to justify hiring a team of lawyers, but too big to just write off. In Colorado, you can sue for up to $7,500 without needing an attorney, and the filing fee is less than $100. I was seeking recovery of Emily's share of our household expenses, plus the non-refundable wedding deposits that I'd paid based on her promise to contribute, plus a reasonable amount for the loans she'd taken from our joint account without repayment. The total came to just over $12,000. Not a fortune, but enough to make a point. Emily found out about the lawsuit when a process server knocked on the door of the house we'd shared, the house she was still living in because the lease was in both our names, and I hadn't wanted to make a scene about it. I know this because she called me 17 times in the hour after she was served, each call going straight to voicemail, each message more hysterical than the last. The first message was angry. "How dare you?" she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking with outrage. "After everything you put me through, now you're trying to steal money from me?" The second message was threatening. She was going to tell everyone what kind of person I really was. She was going to destroy my reputation. She was going to make sure no one in this town ever brought their car to my shop again. By the fifth message, she was crying. She didn't understand how I could be so cruel. She thought I was a good person. She thought we could handle this like adults. By the 10th message, she was bargaining. Maybe we could work something out. Maybe she'd been too hasty at her parents' house. Maybe if I dropped the lawsuit, we could talk about getting back together. I saved every single one of those voicemails to a cloud server that Emily didn't know existed. Not because I planned to use them against her, but because I wanted a record in case she tried to claim later that I'd been the one harassing her. You learn things when you grow up in a small town. You learn that people will say anything to avoid taking responsibility for their own actions. And the best defense against lies is documentation. 2 days after she was served, I got a different kind of message. This one was from Derek, her cousin, the one who had laughed when she threw her ring in the salad. He wanted to meet for a drink to discuss the situation man to man. I agreed, partly because I was curious what he wanted, and partly because I knew it would drive Emily crazy to know we'd been talking. We met at a bar in Denver, neutral territory, a sports bar where the televisions were too loud and the wings were too spicy, and nobody cared who you were or what kind of problems you had. Derek showed up in a polo shirt with a little logo on it, the kind of shirt that costs $200. Because of that little logo, and ordered a craft beer that he clearly didn't enjoy but felt obligated to drink because it was fashionable. After about 10 minutes of small talk that neither of us cared about, he got to the point. "Look, Mark," he said, leaning forward like we were sharing secrets. "I get it. Emily hurt you. She treated you badly. Nobody's saying otherwise. But this lawsuit thing, it's making things really uncomfortable for the family. People are talking. The grandmother is upset." I took a long sip of my beer, which was not craft and not fashionable, and tasted exactly like beer is supposed to taste. "People are talking," I repeated. "What are they saying?" Derek shifted in his seat. "They're saying you're trying to destroy Emily's life over a breakup. They're saying you're being vindictive, petty. You know how it looks, right? A guy suing his ex-girlfriend for money? It's not a good look, man." I set down my beer and looked him straight in the eye. "Let me ask you something, Derek. If someone owed you $12,000 and refused to pay, what would you do?" He blinked. "That's different." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, Emily made commitments she didn't keep. She signed contracts she had no intention of honoring. She took money from accounts we shared together and used it for things that didn't benefit both of us. And then, when she decided she didn't want to be in the relationship anymore, she humiliated me in front of her whole family instead of having an adult conversation. So you tell me, Derek, what exactly is the difference?" He didn't have an answer for that. He mumbled something about family loyalty and how things could get ugly if I pushed this, but his heart wasn't in it. I think, on some level, he knew I was right. He just didn't want to admit it, because that would mean admitting that his family had enabled Emily's behavior for years, that they'd watched her treat me like a second-class citizen and never said a word because they agreed with her. I finished my beer, dropped enough cash on the table to cover both our tabs, because unlike Emily, I pay my debts, and stood up to leave. "Tell the family I'll see them in court," I said, "and tell Emily that if she wants to settle, she knows where to find me." She didn't want to settle. Of course she didn't. Emily had never backed down from a fight in her life, especially not one where she was clearly in the wrong. Instead, she hired a lawyer, or rather, her father hired a lawyer, some slick guy from a big firm in Denver, who probably charged more per hour than I made in a day. The lawyer sent me a letter full of legal jargon that basically boiled down to this: Emily was going to counter-sue for emotional distress caused by my harassment campaign. She was going to claim that I had been financially abusive throughout our relationship, controlling the money and forcing her into dependency. She was going to paint me as the villain and herself as the victim, and her expensive lawyer was going to make sure a jury believed every word of it. I read that letter 3 times, then I filed it away with everything else. Because here's the thing about people like Emily and her expensive lawyer. They assume that everyone plays by the same rules they do, that everyone can be intimidated into backing down if you throw enough money and threats at them. They don't understand people like me, People who grew up fixing things with their hands. People who know that the best way to solve a problem is to work through it methodically, one step at a time. I didn't countersue. I didn't write angry letters or hire my own fancy lawyer. I just kept gathering evidence and preparing for my day in court. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of crisp Colorado day when the air is so clear you can see for miles and the mountains look like they were painted onto the sky. I put on the one suit I owned, the same one I'd worn to my father's funeral, and drove to the courthouse with my lockbox of evidence sitting on the passenger seat beside me. Emily was already there when I arrived, surrounded by her support team like a celebrity arriving at a premiere. Her mother, her father, Derek, and the expensive lawyer in his expensive suit. Emily herself was dressed like she was going to a job interview. Conservative blouse and skirt, minimal makeup, every inch the wronged woman seeking justice. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She was too busy whispering with her lawyer about strategy. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Karen Sullivan, and I liked her immediately. She had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had heard every excuse in the book and stopped being impressed by any of them decades ago. She called the court to order, reviewed the basics of the case, and then asked me to present my evidence. I had practiced this in front of the mirror a dozen times, but when the moment came, I didn't need to perform. I just told the truth. I walked the judge through the timeline of my relationship with Emily. I showed her the lease agreement where we'd both signed, promising to pay 50% of the rent. I showed her the bank statements proving that I'd paid 100% for the past 6 months. I showed her the text messages where Emily had promised over and over again to pay me back next week or next month or as soon as my bonus comes through. I showed her the wedding contracts and the receipts for deposits, proving that I'd paid for everything based on Emily's assurance that we were building a life together. I showed her the pattern of expenses that didn't match her stated income, the hotel rooms and fancy restaurants that she'd hidden from me while claiming she couldn't afford to pay her share of the bills. And then, because I wanted the judge to understand the full context of what had happened, I showed her the screenshots of Emily's social media posts from the night she'd broken up with me. She'd posted about it before she'd even gotten home from her parents' house, bragging about how she'd finally stood up for herself and cut loose the dead weight. The comments were full of congratulations from her friends, people who didn't know me, who had only ever heard Emily's version of events, cheering her on for having the courage to level up. Judge Sullivan looked at all of this without expression. Then she turned to Emily's lawyer and asked if he had a response. The lawyer stood up and launched into his prepared speech about emotional abuse and financial control, and the terrible trauma his client had suffered during her relationship with me. He painted a picture of a controlling man who had used money as a weapon, who had isolated Emily from her support system, who had made her feel worthless and dependent. It was a compelling story, and if I hadn't been there to live through the reality, I might have believed it myself. But then the judge started asking questions, and the whole thing fell apart. "Mr. Parker," she said to the lawyer, "your client claims that Mr. Reed financially controlled her during their relationship. But according to these bank records, Ms. Mason had her own income, her own credit cards, and access to a joint account that she apparently used quite freely for personal expenses. Can you explain how that constitutes financial control?" The lawyer tried to spin it, something about psychological manipulation and coerced consent, but the judge wasn't buying it. "And Ms. Mason," she continued, turning to Emily directly, "you claim that you were forced to sign these contracts under duress, but there's no evidence of any threats or coercion. And in fact, several of these text messages show you actively planning the wedding and making demands about specific vendors. Is it your testimony that Mr. Reed somehow forced you to insist on flying in orchids from South America?" Emily's face went red. She looked at her lawyer, expecting him to save her, but there was nothing he could do. The evidence was too clear, too damning, too thoroughly documented. And then came the moment that changed everything. Judge Sullivan was reviewing the timeline of Emily's affair, which I'd included not to embarrass her, but to explain the discrepancies in her spending. When she paused and looked up with narrowed eyes. "Ms. Mason, who is this B that you're exchanging messages with throughout this period? The one you're meeting for dinners and hotel stays that you apparently charge to your shared household expenses?" Emily went pale. Her lawyer whispered something urgently in her ear, but she was already stammering. That's, that's private. It's not relevant to the case. I'll decide what's relevant, the judge said. Answer the question. Emily looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal. Her parents were staring at her father's face slowly turning the color of a ripe tomato as he began to understand what was being implied. His name is Brian, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian Hollister. I watched Gerald Mason's face as recognition dawned. I didn't know who Brian Hollister was, but apparently Gerald did, because he made a choking sound and gripped the edge of his seat like he was trying not to fall over. It came out in bits and pieces over the next few minutes, dragged out of Emily by the judge's pointed questions and her lawyer's increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. Brian Hollister was a regional director at Emily's PR firm. He was married to Diane Hollister, whose maiden name was Thornton, as in Thornton and Associates, the company that owned the PR firm where Emily worked. In other words, Emily had been having an affair with her boss's son-in-law, the man who was married to the owner's daughter, the man whose position in the company depended entirely on staying in the good graces of his father-in-law. The court took a brief recess while Emily's lawyer tried to contain the nuclear explosion that had just gone off in his case. I stepped outside for some air and found Derek standing on the courthouse steps, looking like he'd just witnessed a car crash. Did you know? He asked me. About Hollister? I shook my head. I knew there was someone. I didn't know who. Derek laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. Brian Hollister. Of all the people she could have picked, that family's going to destroy her. You know that, right? The Thorntons don't forgive. They don't forget. Emily's career in this town is over. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Emily had made her choices, and now she was going to live with the consequences. I hadn't planned for this particular piece of information to come out, but I wasn't sorry that it had. The rest of the hearing was almost anticlimactic. Judge Sullivan ruled in my favor on every count, noting that Emily had clearly violated multiple verbal and written agreements and that there was no evidence whatsoever to support her claims of emotional abuse. Emily was ordered to pay me the full amount I'd requested, $12,347, plus court costs and interest. Her lawyer asked for a payment plan. The judge agreed that Emily could pay in installments over the next 12 months, with automatic garnishment from any wages she earned if she missed a payment. Emily just sat there, staring at the table in front of her, not crying, but not far from it. I gathered up my evidence and walked out of that courtroom feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not satisfaction, but something like completion. Like I'd finally finished a job that had been weighing on me for too long. Outside, Emily's parents were waiting. Patricia was crying, big theatrical sobs that were more about her own embarrassment than her daughter's pain. Gerald was on his phone, already trying to get ahead of the story, calling contacts at Emily's firm to see if there was any way to spin this that didn't make his family look like fools. He saw me and stepped into my path, his face ugly with rage. You happy now? He demanded. You just ruined my daughter's life over a few $1,000s. Was it worth it? Was your precious pride worth destroying her? I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had spent 2 years making me feel like I wasn't good enough for his family, who had looked at my work-roughened hands and seen something dirty, who had never once asked me about my life or my hopes or my dreams because he'd already decided I didn't have any worth knowing about. Gerald, I said, your daughter made her own choices, all of them. I just made sure she paid for them. I walked past him to my truck, ignoring Patricia's wails and Derek's awkward attempts to apologize on behalf of a family that had never apologized for anything in their lives. I got in, started the engine, and drove away from that courthouse without looking back. The weeks after the trial were strange. I'd spent so long preparing for battle that I didn't quite know what to do with peace. I threw myself into work, taking on projects I'd been putting off, spending long hours in the shop with my tools and my music and the comforting smell of honest labor. The Chevelle finally got her paint, a deep midnight blue that seemed to swallow the light and then reflect it back in waves. I installed the interior, burgundy leather that I'd stitched by hand during late nights when I couldn't sleep. I tuned the carburetor until she ran so smooth, You couldn't tell she was on unless you listened for it. And then, on a clear Sunday morning in December, I took her out on the mountain roads for her first real drive. There's a freedom that comes from behind the wheel of a perfectly restored muscle car, a feeling that's hard to describe to people who haven't experienced it. The world shrinks down to just you and the machine, the road unwinding in front of you, the engine singing its deep-throated song. All the noise and drama of regular life falls away, and you're left with something pure, something that makes sense in a way that human relationships almost never do. I drove for hours that day, up into the mountains and back down again, pushing the Chevelle to her limits and discovering that she exceeded every one of my expectations. By the time I pulled back into the shop, the sun was setting, and I was genuinely happy for the first time in longer than I could remember. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when there is a scandal involved. Within a week of the trial, everyone in Flagstone knew some version of what had happened between me and Emily. Most of it was exaggerated, some of it was completely made up, but the core truth remained. She had cheated on me, humiliated me, stolen from me, and I had taken her to court and won. The reaction surprised me. I'd expected people to side with her, to see me as the bitter ex-boyfriend who couldn't let go. Instead, I found myself approached by person after person who wanted to shake my hand, to tell me they admired what I'd done, to share their own stories of being burned by people who thought they were too good to face consequences. Old Henry from the hardware store stopped me one afternoon to tell me about his first wife, who'd run off with his business partner back in 1982 and had never paid back the loans he'd co-signed for her. I was too proud to take her to court, he said, shaking his head at his younger self. Figured real men didn't sue their exes, cost me my house and my credit and most of my 30s. You did the right thing, son. Don't let anyone tell you different. Even people who didn't know me personally seemed to treat me differently. The woman at the coffee shop started giving me my drinks for free, claiming I'd earned it. The mailman, a guy I'd never exchanged more than a nod with, stopped to chat one day about his favorite muscle cars and asked if I'd ever considered doing a restoration on his father's old Pontiac. Business at the shop picked up too, as people who might have hesitated to trust their expensive classic cars to a guy they'd never met suddenly decided that Mark Reed was exactly the kind of person they wanted working on their vehicles. I expanded the shop that spring, bought out the empty warehouse next door, and converted it into a proper restoration bay, with a paint booth and a lift system and enough space to work on 3 cars at once. Hired 2 new mechanics, guys I'd known for years who'd been wasting their talents at dealerships where they were treated like interchangeable parts. Put up a new sign that said Reed's Restoration in letters you could see from the highway. I also started dating again, slowly and carefully, with none of the blind optimism that had gotten me into trouble with Emily. I met someone through the shop, actually, a woman named Sandra, who brought in her late husband's 1965 Corvette for a memorial restoration. She was quiet and kind and understood that some things take time to heal. We weren't in any rush. We had coffee sometimes and dinner a few times, and we talked about cars and life and the strange ways that grief can transform into something bearable if you give it enough space. I hadn't heard from Emily since the trial. I heard about her, of course, because people love to gossip, especially when the gossip is about someone's downfall. The thing with Brian Hollister had exploded exactly the way Derek had predicted. The Thorntons had forced Brian to choose between his marriage and his affair, and Brian, being the kind of man who had an affair in the first place, had chosen his marriage without a second thought. He'd thrown Emily under the bus so fast she probably had tire tracks on her back, publicly claiming that she had pursued him, harassed him, threatened to expose their relationship if he didn't leave his wife. Emily had been fired from her job, of course. The Thorntons made sure she was blacklisted from every PR firm in the Denver metropolitan area. Her friends, the ones who had cheered her on when she was leveling up, suddenly discovered that they barely knew her and certainly couldn't be expected to help her find a new position. Her parents, humiliated by the scandal, had retreated to their perfect house in their perfect neighborhood and stopped returning her calls. Last I heard, she was working at a call center in the suburbs, sharing an apartment with 2 strangers she'd found on Craigslist, driving a car that was 7 years old and had a persistent check engine light that she couldn't afford to get fixed. I didn't feel good about that exactly, but I didn't feel bad about it either. She had made her choices. Actions have consequences. These are lessons most people learn in childhood, but some people don't learn them until much later, and the tuition is always expensive. 6 months after the trial, on a cold evening in late March when the snow was still piled high on the sides of the road and the shop was quiet because everyone with sense was home by the fire, I heard a car pull up outside. Not a customer, not this late, and nobody I was expecting. I was cleaning up for the night, putting away tools and making sure everything was in its place when I heard footsteps crunching through the gravel. Then a knock on the metal door of the shop, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the door and found Emily standing there. She looked like a different person. Gone was the designer clothing, the perfect makeup, the carefully maintained facade of success and sophistication. She was wearing a cheap jacket that didn't fit well, her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face was bare and tired and older than I remembered. She was shivering, standing there in the cold without gloves, her breath making little clouds in the air. "Can I come in?" she asked, and her voice was different too, stripped of the confidence that had always sounded, in retrospect, more like arrogance than self-assurance. I stepped aside and let her enter. Not because I wanted to talk to her, but because it was cold and she looked miserable, and turning her away felt unnecessarily cruel. She walked into the shop and stopped when she saw the Chevelle, now complete, gleaming under the overhead lights like a museum piece. She stared at it for a long moment, and I realized she was trying not to cry. "You finished it," she said. "It's beautiful." I didn't respond. I just waited for her to say what she'd come to say. She turned to face me, her arms wrapped around herself the same way they'd been the day we met. Back when I thought she was a bright bird who needed protection from a cold world. "I made a mistake," she said. "A lot of mistakes. I know that now. Brian was nothing. He was less than nothing. He used me and threw me away like I was garbage. And the worst part is that I deserved it. I treated you the same way, and I didn't even realize I was doing it until it was too late." She took a step toward me, her eyes searching my face for something, for some sign that I might be willing to listen. "I've been thinking about you every day since the trial. Not just because of the money, although that's been hard too, but because you were the only person who ever looked at me like I was worth something, like I mattered for who I was instead of what I could do for them. And I threw that away for what? For fancy dinners and hotel rooms and the attention of a married man who never had any intention of leaving his wife? I was so stupid, Mark. I was so incredibly stupid." She was crying now, tears cutting tracks down her cheeks, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I hurt you worse than I've ever hurt anyone. But I'm asking anyway because I don't know what else to do. Can we try again? Can we start over? I'll be different this time, I promise. I'll be the person you thought I was when we first met. I'll be better." She reached out toward my hand, and I looked at her reaching fingers and thought about everything that had happened between us. The good times, the bad times, the lies and the truths, and the moments when I believed in a future that was never going to happen. I thought about rust. See, here's the thing about rust that people don't understand unless they work with metal. Rust isn't just on the surface. It works its way into the structure, weakening it from the inside, creating hidden pockets of decay that can cause catastrophic failure without warning. You can sand it off and paint over it and make it look shiny and new, but if the rust has gotten deep enough, it's still there underneath, still eating away at the integrity of the metal, still waiting to break at the worst possible moment. Emily was like that. The surface had changed, sure. She'd been humbled, broken down, stripped of all the things she'd thought made her special. But the rust was still there. The fundamental flaw in her character that had allowed her to treat me like a tool to be used and discarded when something shinier came along. Painting over that wouldn't fix it. Nothing would fix it. Some things are too broken to repair. I stepped back, putting distance between us, and I saw the hope drain out of her eyes as she understood what that movement meant. "Emily," I said, and my voice was calm and level and completely without anger. "Rust doesn't disappear just because you paint over it. You made your choice that night at your parents' table. You made it in front of everyone, and you can't unmake it now just because you don't like how things turned out. She made a small sound, something between a sob and a protest, but I kept talking. I wish you well. I genuinely do. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, and I hope you're happy someday. But that happiness isn't going to come from me. What we had is over, and it has been for a long time. I reached for the control panel on the wall and pressed the button that activated the bay door. The heavy metal gate began to descend, a slow mechanical rumble that filled the silence between us. "Mark, please," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Don't do this. We can work it out. We can fix it together." I shook my head slowly. "Some things can't be fixed. You should go." The gate continued its descent, closing the gap between us inch by inch. Emily stood frozen, watching it come down, her face a mask of disbelief and grief, and something that might have been recognition, the final acceptance that this was really happening, that there was no magic word she could say to make it all go back to the way it was before. "Mark," she said one last time, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the machinery. The gate touched down with a solid thunk, sealing off the shop from the outside world. Through the small windows in the door, I could see her standing there, alone in the darkness, her breath still, making those little clouds in the cold night air. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps crunching through the gravel until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stood there for a minute, alone in my shop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had always made more sense to me than people. I felt something, some residual twinge of the love I'd once had for her, but it was faint and distant, like the echo of an engine that had long since been shut down. Then I walked over to the Chevelle, ran my hand along her perfect paint, and smiled. I had work to do in the morning. A customer was bringing in a 1969 Camaro that needed a full frame-off restoration, and I'd promised to have an estimate ready by noon. Sandra had asked if I wanted to grab dinner afterward, and I'd said yes because that's what you do when you're moving forward instead of looking back. Life goes on. The broken things stay broken, and the things that can be fixed get fixed, and you learn to tell the difference between them. I turned off the lights and walked out the back door into the cold Colorado night. Above me, the stars were sharp and clear, and the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of traffic on the highway, people going places, living their lives, making their own choices for better or worse. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove home to the apartment above the shop that was small and simple and entirely mine. I had a cup of coffee, read a few chapters of a book about engine modifications, and went to bed early because tomorrow was going to be a long day. And if I dreamed that night about a woman in an expensive coat who had wandered into my life at a fall festival and changed everything, well, that's the kind of thing that happens when you're human. But when I woke up, the dream was already fading, replaced by the practical concerns of a new day, and by the time I'd finished my first cup of coffee, I'd forgotten it entirely. That's the thing about time. It doesn't heal all wounds, not really, but it does give you distance, perspective, the ability to look back at the person you were and recognize how much you've changed. I wasn't the same Mark Reed who had fallen for Emily Mason's bright smile and designer clothes. I was harder now, more cautious, less willing to give my trust to people who hadn't earned it. But I was also more at peace, more comfortable in my own skin, more certain of who I was and what I wanted out of life. Emily had thought she could forget me in a week. She'd thought I was replaceable, forgettable, just another stepping stone on her path to something better. But here's the truth she never understood. Some people leave marks on you that don't fade, and I had left my mark on her far deeper than she'd ever left hers on me. She would carry the weight of what she'd done for the rest of her life, while I had already put it down and walked away. That's not revenge. That's not justice. That's just the natural consequence of choices made and roads taken. You reap what you sow, and Emily had sown a field of broken promises and betrayed trusts, and had now harvested exactly what she deserved. As for me, I had a Camaro to restore, and a Corvette to finish, and a woman who understood that good things take time. I had a business that was thriving and a reputation that I'd earned through hard work and honest dealing. I had the mountains outside my window and the smell of motor oil in my clothes and the certain knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not bad for a guy who was supposed to be forgotten in a week.